Hi, my name is Ray Chang, and I have the privilege of serving as the Executive Director of the 10 by 10 Collaboration, as well as the President of the Asian American Christian Collaborative. We're going to have a conversation brought to you by the 10 by 10 Collaboration, which is a youth discipleship initiative seeking to make faith matter more for 10 million young people over the next 10 years. We have over 140 partners that are engaged in the work, and we are so thrilled to be pressing in on this important conversation with several of my wonderful friends and colleagues who are in ministry, doing important ministry out of their Asian American background, heritage, culture, with Asian Americans in mind. And what we're going to be primarily talking about is whether cultural integration and cultural preservation and passing down our cultures from one generation to the next is actually important to the faith formation of young people that are in the emerging generations. But before we answer that question, I'd love for each of you to introduce yourselves. Why don't we start, Sherine?
Sure. My name is Sherine. I'm the missions pastor at Tapestry Church. I oversee both local and global outreach ministries. I am Sri Lankan. I was born in Lebanon, grew up in Sri Lanka, and I moved to California for college. Met my pastor who planted our church and have been staying here since.
Hi everyone, my name is Giovanny Panginda, and I am an Indonesian American youth and college pastor of 4 churches. Of 4 churches. I have an 8 a.m., 11 a.m., 2 p.m., 5 p.m., all like spread out. Pretty much on a Sunday, I don't get home until like 9 p.m.
Oh, wow.
And my day starts at like 7 a.m. So, but I was born in Jakarta. I came to the States when I was 4, and I've pretty much lived in LA all my life, different parts of LA. So.
And you also work at?
Oh, yes. I also work at the Fuller Youth Institute. I'm the social media lead there. And I love being able to be there and take what I know about youth ministry at FYI, put it into my churches, and then also experiment with my churches, and then take it back up and give it to FYI.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
What do you do with all your free time?
I play badminton.
Heidi?
My name is Heidi. I am Korean American. I have been a staff member at EKKO Church in Fullerton. My official role is liturgist, and I've been there for about 7 years.
Well, so let's begin. How important is cultural integration or preserving our ethnic and cultural identity and heritage important to ministering to the next generation or emerging generations? Who wants to go first?
Ooh, me. Okay.
Let's go.
Okay. So I want to like approach the question in like maybe 2 parts. Like number 1 is like my part. I think selfishly, I want to say it is important, partly because being, raised here and just seeing, my own upbringing and how I started questioning my cultural identity when I was around my students' age, like around ages of 18 to 21. I started trying to figure out like, what does it mean to be Indonesian, and what does it mean to be American, and what does it mean to be Indonesian American? Like, what does that look like? And where's God in that aspect? So my second part, I guess, is if I were talking to my students, I would still say yes. And I think it's because I always tell my students, God made you uniquely Indonesian American. You were born in this time period as an Indonesian American, and there's something beautiful and unique and great about that. And we just got to figure out what's next. Like what does it mean, after, like to be Indonesian and American and both. So I want to say yes. I think it's important for us to have a cultural integration, especially when it comes to faith. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll jump into that. I think, so a little bit of my story, I grew up in a predominantly white area in Northern California, and I was born in 1991, so it was back when like people didn't really know what Korea was. It was like, oh, are you Chinese? Like, what is Korean? And then fast forward to now where K-pop has just, we were talking about how Korean, he referred to Koreans as the new colonizers.
Colonizers, yeah.
Which I was like, oh.
Cultural
Cultural
That's
colonizers.
some fighting
Yeah.
words there. But, you know, I think cultural integration for discipleship is not just for the younger generation, but I feel like as a Korean American who was born in the States, it's part of our discipleship now. And I feel like people who have grown up as Asian American, to live into what that means and to find out that identity for ourselves is incredibly crucial to our discipleship. Because if not, we sort of adopt, you know, the predominant culture here in America, which is white culture. And I think by living into and understanding your identity as whether it's Korean American, whether it's Indonesian American or Sri Lankan American, I think without that you lose the beauty and the color and the depth of what it means to come to the table with all that God has created us to be in our identities. So yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think without that understanding, without discovering and having that curiosity of what that means, you kind of fall into the dominant narrative, which erases our identity. And so that's what I really love about what AACC is doing. Actually being part of the Civil Rights Tour was one of the first times I realized that Asian American identity isn't of itself an identity. So I feel like I'm still learning what that means, how to integrate that and how to discover what that looks like through the stories of our ancestors.
Yeah.
I love that. I mean, it's actually, Heidi, it's the first time I've been called a Sri Lankan American. So that was kind of cool. I mean, growing up in Sri Lanka, I've always thought, you know, to be Christian is to be more white. So that's been the journey.
Totally.
So even moving here, I think, you know, to get close to Jesus, go to a white church, make a lot of white friends. You know, that's sort of like the underneath narrative that I've lived into. So I think this conversation in itself is like a whole paradigm shift for me. So I would say I'm still like really curious and want to know what that would look like. But I think even like hearing like you're Sri Lankan American, like that's very empowering to me. And I think of just the Asian American church here. I think perhaps we don't have the language that is articulated for us in terms of who we are, what our story is, and what is our calling in the Church of Jesus. So I think those are some things that come to mind for me.
Yeah. I mean, this is a very kind of unique and not frequently seen combination of people, right? I mean, you have a Sri Lankan, you have an Indonesian, mixed race Korean, and then I myself am Korean American. And, you know, throughout the day, we've been recording different conversations with different variations of people from the Asian American diaspora. And we're talking about cultural integration and how important it is to identity formation, how important it is to our faith. What's at stake if we don't integrate the cultures of our communities, of our ethnic communities, and then also keep in mind how our forebears have either passed down the faith that was distinctly expressed through our kind of cultural expressions and through our cultures. What's at stake if we don't do it?
Just a clarifying question. Could you explain a little bit more of like what cultural integration means for you?
Yeah, so I would say cultural integration is the preservation and the infusion of our ethnic and cultural identities, especially those who have come from families where their Christianity was very much expressed through their cultural lenses, oftentimes from across the oceans, but also, you know, emerging and preserved through the church expressions, mostly through immigrant churches here. And then the opposite of cultural integration would be either assimilation or just full kind of adoption into the majority narrative or practice. What's at stake if we simply assimilate?
I would say maybe just a limited understanding of God and His mission. I think when I moved to California, it's just like really excited, like, oh, finally away from a predominantly Buddhist country, in a Christian country, I guess. And maybe now I'll be much more resourced and empowered and ready to join God and His mission. Joined a white church, but a couple months into it, very disappointed with like, this is it? Like, I don't know if this is what I was made for. I think that whole expression of understanding God through a very white normative lens felt very like God was very limited. And my journey of, meeting a Korean American pastor, being part of that journey of, planting a church and seeing it grow, I think it opened a whole new door to see, wow, God is beyond what I had settled for. He is full of possibility, and His mission is beyond what I've read in the books or understood so far. So that's something that comes to mind for me.
For me, it's about taste. And what I mean by that is maybe we could take a look at it as if like it's fried rice, right? So if our Christianity is just like white, right? Then it's a specific kind of fried rice. But when you look at all the different Asian countries, they have their own unique ways of cooking rice or fried rice. And similarly, I think when it comes to our cultural identity as the different kinds of Asian Americans and being Christian, I think it adds a certain spice to that life. A spice to that fried rice, so to speak. And so as a result, like we help other people taste that rice, meaning we help other people taste and experience God totally different from what they're like typically experience. And if we deny that, then we're taking away a certain aspect of the fried rice making, I guess. I hope that makes sense.
That's so helpful. Yeah, very creative.
Yeah. I think when we default to, when we don't integrate well culturally, when we don't understand that integration is necessary, I think we assume that one way is the only way, which is the dominant way. And in this case, in the American way, it's the white evangelical way. And so I guess pointing back to your metaphor of fried rice, it's seeing one ingredient as if it's the only way of doing things, when there's a whole, like you said, a whole spice rack of other expressions. And so without culture and integration, it's sort of closing the cupboards and not opening it up to seeing the depth of flavor and the depth of understanding of how we're supposed to not only interact with God, but truly interact with one another. It's adopting a global mentality rather than assuming the American way is the only way.
Yeah. I mean, you all work with youth, and you see youth, you interact with youth. Do they care? Do they care about whether their faith is embodied in a particular culture in a particular time and place, or are most of them saying we don't really care? And what do you think, regardless of the answer?
I want to say that some of them do care, and then the ones that seem like they don't care actually care. And what I mean by that is, I have some students who are Chinese Indonesian, and then I have other students who are a specific kind of Indonesian, because Indonesia is a group of different islands, and in each of these islands, there's all these different tribes, right? So to call someone Indonesian, yes, we're Indonesian, but we're actually even more. It's almost like in America we have a lot of different Native American tribes. So to call someone just an Apache, that would to deny a different aspect of who they are. They're also a mix of Tongvan. Like there's a tribe here, the Tongva tribe, and so Indonesia, like we are because we're so mixed. Some of my students are even kind of caring about like, oh, what kind of mix we are, and especially being part of an Indonesian church.
Being part of 4 Indonesian churches.
4 churches, yeah. As much as we have my Chinese Indonesian side, I also have the ones that are more ethnic, so specific. So what I mean is there's certain Indonesian churches that are Ambon tribe. There's certain Indonesians that are the Batak tribe. And that is in its own, like, they're teaching their own, like, culture and their own, little languages as much as they are still Indonesian. They're still integrating their own culture to it, too. So I think, for at least for a lot of my students, they do care. And for the ones that don't care, I think they're going to start caring soon. And what I mean by that is I'm getting glimpses of some of them, especially as some of my students, they recently have faced the death of a dad or a death of a mom or even experiencing the death of their grandparents. And I'm seeing them kind of like turning to me and kind of asking questions about like, oh, I wish I spent more time with my grandma, asking them about how such and such happened, what life was back in, Indonesia. Because then they started realizing that they might never unlock that their full selves if they don't have this certain information, right? It's like I've even shared my story with my students about how I took a DNA test to kind of figure out what I am. And partly because, well, I guess I could share it, but I found out that my grandma was not my grandma. She was actually my step grandma. And that was like a huge, like big deal for me because I was like, wait, so what does that mean then? What am I then? What about my biological grandma? And so, long story short, I discovered that I am actually a lot more Filipino than I am Indonesian. And I'm sure there's like some history behind that. And then there's aspects of me that are Chinese, like, okay, that's not a surprise. But all that is what makes me who I am. And so I tell my students, like go discover, who you are culturally. If I can like add, like, so I even had, I've mentored some of my white students. I have some white students and, I told them like, you're not just white. You know that, right? They're like, yeah. And I actually had them, get in touch of, more with their, ancestry. So they got to take a look at and realize, oh, they're not just German, they're also Dutch and they're also Swedish, and like to take a look at their history more. And by helping my white students understand that they are more than just white, it helped them see that, okay, yeah, they are immigrants, in a way. They come from ancestors who are immigrants. And in doing so, that connects their story with our church's story of being immigrants, So I think cultural integration and faith is still a big deal, I think, for students. Yeah.
I would say perhaps maybe they don't know if it's an option to care, and maybe they don't feel safe to care. So, we've been, as Asian Americans, in many ways, we've been silenced and we've been taught for generations to assimilate. And even like having that option to care is a privilege. So, I'd imagine, students wanting to know, like, what is my story? But wait, I gotta just go. I just gotta go with the American hustle, do what I'm told and achieve and live this life, right? Or am I really safe to do that? Like the moment I start speaking up, what will my journey look like? What will the opportunities I'll have, and what opportunities will I miss? Yeah, and personally for me, that's been the journey where I'm not quite sure like what to articulate and name as to like what my story is, what my identity is. And I'm not sure when I'm supposed to speak. And if I do speak, what will be the result of that? You know what I mean? So.
Yeah, I think you touched on something that I was kind of thinking about. Have you guys heard that one quote recently where someone said like Asians are white basically in America now, like given maybe like the economic status that Asian Americans now have, and education and so it's interesting. I think the youth, at least, I don't want to speak on your guys' experience, but like I was sharing before, growing up Asian American was not cool, very not cool. Having Korean things, I remember when like family friends would go to Korea and bring back like Korean socks or Korean like hair berets, like we would just go straight in the trash. And those things are now treasured, people want that kind of stuff now. And so I've always been really curious about how the youth, particularly Korean Americans, are experiencing the sudden like global shift of popularity in Korean culture, but also as an Asian American then what that means, because it's almost like the American culture is gaslighting the Asian American experience, saying, oh, well, you've worked hard enough, so you've, clawed your way up to the higher echelons, but you're still not, you don't belong here yet. And so I'm curious how the youth are wrestling with that kind of unspoken language of somehow being in the room but not being invited to the table, and almost being like, oh, your identity is celebrated, but you're still different and you're still not us. And so I am curious. I think observing and talking with the youth in my context, there's a lack of like a language. And I speak for myself as well. I have like a 5-year-old's Korean vocabulary. And I think many of the now third generation Korean Americans don't have an understanding of what our language is, but you're connected by purely the way you look. And so there is an othering that's happening, but I was thinking like, you guys have it easy. At least you guys are cool now, right? But at the same time, I'm wondering, being separated by, and almost like not having an obvious struggle, I wonder if it's harder. It's almost like a hidden cancer that they might not know. Kind of like what you were saying. It's like an unspoken feeling of you've entered into this room where maybe some doors have been open for you because of the previous generations, but there's still something in the air where you're like, I don't think I belong here. And so that cultural identity and that formation, and I think that's why learning our history, like through the AACC, is so integral and necessary of understanding, like, oh, this has been going on for generations before I came onto the scene.
I mean, that's good. What all of you are sharing is so helpful and important and unique, because you're all speaking from different contexts. It's not like Koreans and Indonesians are often seen in the same community. And Sri Lankans are often like wrestling with the question of like, are we considered Asian American? I mean, I'm struck by the fact that you've never heard Sri Lankan American before. That's a remarkable thing, and at the same time, it's not uncommon, right? That we're always wrestling with whether we are American enough. I was just having dinner with the head of like the Korean Church Association in the Southern California area, and we were talking about kind of his experience. He was adopted into Alaska, but then heard that there were a lot of Korean immigrants and Korean Americans that were struggling in the LA, SoCal area, and so in the 80s he moved from Alaska to LA after he was serving in the police force for some time. And he thought, oh, there's a lot more Koreans here, so of course things will be better. I was really surprised to hear, especially because he's a 1.5 generation Korean American Christian, for him to say, my biggest concern is that all of these Korean American parents are telling their kids, just be American, just be American, just be American, when they'll never be fully accepted as American. And at the same time, he's like, we have to carve out our own spaces, because unless we do that, we're always kind of beholden to whatever spaces others create for us.
Yeah.
And if they pull funding or they lock the doors or whatnot, he was like, that's the challenge. And so for him, the church is such an integral part of the preservation of Asian American, for him, more specific Korean American identity.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is, oftentimes what you said, Heidi, is we don't often see our own struggles and our own suffering, and they're not often seen by other communities. And I wonder if a part of that actually leads to the erasure and the invisibility of the real suffering that actually does take place because of the stereotypes that maybe make it seem like Asian Americans aren't a part of like the suffering class or the marginalized class or the oppressed class. And then at the same time, I'm hearing you, Gio, say you're at 4 churches, at 4 Indonesian churches. And from what I know is they're all different denominations.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing a part of it is because they don't have the staff funding, they don't have the economics of scale to actually help make sure that each of these churches are thriving in their ministry to young people.
Yeah.
I guess the question I have for all of you is, what does ministry to emerging Asian American generations need to look like that either looks consistent with what is currently there or deviates with what's currently there? How do we effectively reach and disciple the next generation?
I would say understanding their world. I think Asian American identity is complex and diverse, and there's so much to learn. And I think it's a journey. There's no cookie cutter answers. But I think the journey to understanding takes long-term work, commitment, right? So it's not just like, here's the problem, let's plan a church, let's go with it. But it's more of saying, let's commit to this. We see the opportunity, we see the marginalization, we see God's heart wanting to enter this space. How do we then commit to the long term, saying we will do this, but we don't have the answers. But perhaps we can begin with understanding what our story is, understanding what our journey may look like, what our journey has been thus far. I think naming it, and all of that is a journey, right? Like, we don't have language that was built up for us. We don't have a theology for generations that is passed on to us. This is what the Asian American church is and what we've contributed to the global church, right? A lot of that work will take time, but saying, hey, we don't know, but let's commit to this journey of understanding and learning.
Yeah. It's interesting you asked that question, because I think in my ministry context, where a lot of us are first or second gen who are now raising middle schoolers, high schoolers, and it's almost like, a lot of us grew up going to like Friday night youth groups and, just kind of building our own faith in that sense. And so I see there's a struggle with parents because they're like, we want to recreate that. So I think there are some people who are wanting to almost recreate their own like nostalgic sort of like faith formation, through that. Where like, I don't know, Ray, if this was your experience, but like you just spent all your time at the church. But we've been finding that, as the youth are growing up, that those spaces are not necessarily the spaces that they want to be in. They're creating their own communities and their own interests, and they're finding their communities online largely. I think the beautiful thing about this emerging generation is they're so smart and they're so resourceful. And so I think one of the biggest things is giving them space and language, as you were saying, and really history, and educating them and showing them, hey, like, you're coming on the scene and there's people who have paved the way for you, and maybe that's starting with like our own stories. And so sharing even like how, my grandma on my dad's side, she escaped North Korea and then married an American soldier. And she had to because her mom told her that the Japanese were going to kill her kids if they were Korean. And so that happens within a generation. And so I'm thinking about my kids and seeing like how are they going to understand their cultural identity as a Korean American, and how do we integrate that with their faith formation? I think a lot of it has to do with education and making sure that our stories are being shared. Yeah,
I think what you all said really resonated. At the funeral of one of my students' dad, he had to do like a lot of research about his dad in order to share, the story of his dad. And in sharing what he learned, he said that he learned more about himself.
Wow.
And I think that just kind of like is like a callback to kind of, storytelling is a huge thing for so many cultures, right? And storytelling is what connects us to our ancestors, Some of my Latino friends, I grew up in East LA, and they would share me stories about their abuelitas, right? And even though I'm not Latino, like I feel connected in some ways because of the stories that they shared about their grandmas. And mainly because I didn't grow up with a grandma or grandpa, right? And so their grandma and grandpa became mine. Similarly, the grandmas and grandpas at my churches became my grandma and grandpas. So their histories, their stories, dang it, I'm gonna cry. Dang it. Their stories, like I got to absorb. And I think, dang it. I think some of my students, the more they spend with the grandmas and grandpas at our churches, I think they get to see just how privileged they are, or like how blessed they are to be where they're at. I don't know, I'm being emotional here. But yeah, like like what you guys said about like we are here today because of our parents or our grandparents, and as students dive deeper into their own stories and their families, I think that's helpful in helping them to connect with their cultural identity as well as with God. Because I often ask my students, like, get to know your grandparents before they pass away, or get to know your uncles, your aunts, find out their stories, because you don't know when you might not see them again. Again, growing up here, I feel like I'm in a minority of minorities, right? I didn't really grow up like with people who are Indonesian other than my church. So my church became like that safe haven of what it means to be Indonesian. And it was one of the only ways I got to fully and freely experience what it means to be Indonesian, other than at an Indonesian restaurant. But similarly, I try to get my students to think about that. There's not very many of us here in America, and so what are the things that we can preserve that are good in our culture, and what are things that that we can pass on to the next generation.
Both what you shared and the emotions that you expressed are so beautiful, because I think that it resonates with a lot of us, that we feel a sense of loss and lament because so many of us aren't connected to the stories of our parents or our grandparents. I'm just, as you were talking, I was pulling up a text from my friend who this week just said, my grandmother just passed away, and I'm now reading a biography that my grandfather wrote of her. My friend's name is Clark.
Yeah.
And he said, I had no idea, but she was involved in political activism for the democratization of Korea in the 80s.
Wow.
She was involved in political activism during the LA riots in Koreatown in LA. She was also a church planter and seminary professor. And then you could just hear these words, which resonate with what your student was sharing.
Yeah.
I wish these were stories shared when she was alive.
Yeah.
And we just keep going, and he's got this, I don't know, dozens of pages of a book that he's desperately trying to get translated into English because he doesn't speak Korean as well as he would like. And he's just like, I'm now wanting to lean more into things. So he's doing more of his studies around missionaries in Korea and the revival in Pyongyang and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and he's like, I just wish. I just wish.
Why do you think that is, that our churches don't talk about that stuff? Like, is it a mix of like the shame in our culture, or
I mean,
trauma?
I think on one level, with every individual, it's different. I think on another level, there is a collective resistance to wanting to talk about the shameful things that we've either done or that have been done to us, because it either shows a form of weakness or because it brings up too much pain, trauma, or hurt. Talking about the civil rights trip that we took from Southern California to Northern California, there was a Japanese American ministry leader who was with us, and she had never really gone to Manzanar, even though her church is in Southern California, which is where mass Japanese incarceration took place. She had never been to Angel Island before and seen all the carvings in the wall, which includes Japanese names and Japanese lettering. Yeah. And when she went back to her church, she said that she started asking the elderly at her church, who she grew up with, almost 30 years old now, about what their experiences were. Had they been incarcerated with all the other Japanese Americans during World War II? And she'd never known that so many of them had been incarcerated and thrown into these incarceration camps. Yeah. And for her, she's like, it's making me more interested in like leaning in. But there was also the same sadness, which for Koreans is called Han, which is this collective deep sadness that we all experience together that just kind of lingers and hovers over us all the time. Yeah. She said, how much did I miss out on because I had never known this part of so many of our church grandmothers and grandfathers' lives.
Yeah, I'm curious if especially in our church communities, I wonder if it's because we've been influenced primarily by white theologians. It's almost like our cultural identity and our theological understanding are divorced from each other. Like in our church spaces, it's less about like who we are as Asian Americans or our cultural identity, and it's more like the morality of what it means to be a Christian, and so it almost feels like it's divorced. So that's kind of what I was thinking when you brought that up of like, why don't we talk about it? I wonder if by bringing attention to it, it's almost like, I don't know, you're labeled as like being too Asian or like, there was like a term like KP, Korean pride. It was almost like you had to be a self-hating Asian growing up to be accepted. Like, oh, I'm not that Asian, or I'm not, like you don't want to lean too much into your identity. You're almost like trying to assimilate in that way. But I think, you touched on something. I think when you're talking about that loss, it's this felt it's like almost like a loneliness, like that I think a lot of our students or the youth and even maybe ourselves are feeling when we are separated from the roots of our ancestors and those stories die with them. There is this collective loss because these aren't the stories that you see written on paper and like passed on, in the history books. These are spoken with hushed tones or, quickly maybe once over a family table or in passing, those atrocities that our grandparents or even our parents have experienced, it's almost like, well, let's just forget about it because we made it to the promised land, the American dream. So why harp on the past? But I feel like that lack of either communication or the sharing of those stories have created this indiscernible ache in our youth and in ourselves of not knowing who we are. It's like we're like tree stumps, like not connected to the roots of our people, and you start to feel the lack of and the deficiency of those nutrients when one of our elders pass.
Man, I hate to wrap because the conversation is so good, but if you were to give one practical piece of advice for ministry leaders or parents or anyone that's listening in that wants to help their children integrate their cultural identity with their spiritual identity, what would you encourage them to do?
I think as ministry leaders, our faith is rooted in stories, right? The Bible is the love story of God. We are naturally given the framework of finding meaning in our stories, faith in our stories. And I think being aware of what voices are influencing us. So what theologians are we listening to? What quotes are we sharing? Is it just Augustine? Is it just, C.S. Lewis? Those are beautiful and amazing, informative giants, but are we sharing more diverse stories, more diverse voices? So I think practically, if you're teaching, if you're preaching, if you're in any way, shape, or form influencing the next generation, it's what books are you sharing with them, what voices are you sharing with them, what videos, what movies, and how are you amplifying those voices, not only the theologians, the ones that we've grown up with and assumed were the only way.
Love that. So I learned a lot from, I know it's a fictional country, it's called Wakanda, but their aspect of storytelling, again, goes back to storytelling, but in integrating the Wakandan culture and all that. I think for my students, learning, going to the embassy. We went to the Indonesian embassy over here, and we got to see cultural dances, and they had tours, and that was the next best thing, other than going to Indonesia, But also seeing the diversity of, I guess, religions of Indonesia, but specifically for the Christians, my students, they got to see so many different Indonesian pastors at this Indonesian festival at the embassy. But some of them were very intrigued by the cultural dances. And because I know my Filipino brothers and sisters, they are really good at dancing. And I know Indonesians are also pretty good at dancing, but the Indonesian Americans, because we don't really see our cultural dances, we tend to be right?
Have you ever seen Koreans dance?
Oh, yeah.
Wow, yeah. But
it's all over YouTube.
Yeah. But yeah, no, when my students actually get to see these cultural dances, they're like, oh, wow, there's a certain kind of pride that they see, because it's oh, there is something beautiful about that. And I'm like, exactly, because that's the way God made our culture. And let's get more intrigued about our culture. So I think part of it, the practicality, is just helping your students be curious. Curious about what it means to be whatever, ethnic identity you are. Also what it means to be a Christian, and what that looks like for the two.
Yeah, I love that. To add to that, I would say, I think perhaps maybe our generation, we need to step into our space of marginality as Asian Americans and take risk and step into that place with courage. Because I think of a younger generation, they're looking for models, they're looking for we want to, but is that safe? Can we really get there? Is it real? But I think if we were to take risk, it'll be a tough journey for us, but our risks are worth worth it for the next generation. I was a children's pastor for 10 years, and I see some of my students now in college, and some of the truths that we spoke into, like their identity as Asian American, and I see that now, see them now living that out in college, really owning that space of like, yeah, I'm okay being in the Korean American Christian club at UCLA. Like, I don't need to assimilate. I own this identity, and that's really refreshing. And in some ways, I think a lot of the hard work, the messy, beautiful hard work that we step into courageously might not show the results right away, but for generations to come, we're in some ways carving way for them.
Yeah. We're making it normal for them.
Yeah, normalizing.
Yeah.
That's so great. Well, thanks for having this conversation with me. This has been a rich time together, and my hope is that people will really glean from everything that was shared, including the tears. Thank you for sharing the tears. But until next time, we look forward to having you join us. But enjoy this and every other video that comes out in this series.